You're fired. Introducing your useless companion is just a nuisance for us. Get out of here.
Well said, George. Looks like John can't even come up with a retort.
All right, we'll leave now and never come back, but you'll regret this later. As I guided the woman out, George and Andrew hurled unbearable insults and mocking laughter at our backs. I will never forgive these guys, hearing their abusive words. I made a vow to myself. My name is John Smith, and I'm 42 years old. I was born and raised in a quiet residential area of New York City, and I've always hated fitting into molds since I was a kid. As I grew up, I attended a famous private university in the city, but I got bored and questioned the idea of walking a predetermined path, so I dropped out. After that, I wanted to see the wider world, so with just a backpack, I wandered around the globe. From Russia in the north to the southernmost parts of South America, I traveled wherever the wind took me. Whenever I ran out of money, I did part-time or day labor jobs at the local places to get by, repeating this process over and over. After about 2 years of this soul-searching journey, I returned to the U.S. and decided to pursue a path I had set my heart on during my travels. This path was in the culinary world, specifically in a broad sense of American food. When I got back, I started working in the field of American food production in this broader sense, and little by little, I began to see some success. However, due to some unexpected circumstances, I ended up working at a mid-sized trading company called Johnson Trading, which was involved in exporting American food kits overseas. I was formally employed as a seconded employee. This was 9 years ago when I was 33 years old. Since then, I have been working diligently for Johnson Trading, traveling extensively for business. Given my familiarity with overseas markets, I mainly took on business trips to expand our operations in Asia. But last year, in my 8th year at Johnson Trading, the company's founding president passed away suddenly. He had a pre-existing heart condition, but his end was abrupt. With the sudden loss of the founding president, who was the face of the company, Johnson Trading was thrown into great confusion. His only son, George, who had been the executive director, took over as the second president in the meantime. When I heard about the founding president's passing, I was on a long-term business trip abroad in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. In the middle of a major business negotiation in Kuala Lumpur, I managed to wrap things up and returned home a bit late, only to be met with George's cold attitude and biting remarks as the new president. As soon as I returned to the New York headquarters and met George for the first time, he said,
So, you come waltzing back at a time like this with nothing but a measly contract in hand. How could you skip my father's funeral, you useless old employee?
This was my first encounter with George upon returning to the headquarters, and it felt like a bucket of cold water had been thrown over me. I had a deep connection with the late founding president, so I was shocked by the news of his death and wanted to return home immediately. However, I knew that abandoning my work at that moment wouldn't benefit anyone, and it would only disappoint the late president, who had been keen on expanding our market in Asia. So, I persevered, completed the business negotiations, and secured a new contract before returning. George completely disregarded my feelings and trampled on them with his words, which left me speechless and frustrated. George then twisted my silence into a malicious interpretation.
Staying silent and sulking might have been tolerated under my father's lenient regime, John. But now that I'm the new president, you'd better brace yourself. I'm going to ruthlessly weed out all the dead weight.
It was clear that George found me incredibly bothersome. Thus, my work environment at the company became increasingly uncomfortable. Despite the change in presidents, I couldn't afford to be distracted. There was a mountain of work and responsibilities that needed my attention, regardless of the company's leadership. I belonged to the Overseas Business Department, commonly known as the Foreign Affairs Division. At Johnson Trading, the head of the Foreign Affairs Division was a man named Andrew, who was the same age as me. However, Andrew wasn't particularly skilled or accomplished. He hadn't earned his position through any significant achievements. In fact, under the late president's regime, which was known for its fair meritocracy, Andrew had remained a regular employee. But with the sudden death of the founding president and George's ascension to president, Andrew experienced an unusual 3-level promotion, suddenly becoming the division head. As you might guess, Andrew was such an obsequious sycophant to George that it was almost nauseating to watch, and he would flatter him endlessly. If George said something black was white, Andrew would agree without hesitation. He was an astonishingly servile yes man. To George, who wanted to surround himself with yes men, there was no servant more obedient than Andrew. Thanks to George's direct order, Andrew has been the head of the Foreign Affairs Division since last year, technically making him my boss. I didn't care much about this as I was busy with work, but Andrew had the nerve to constantly interfere with my work. He never missed an opportunity to make snide remarks and try to one-up me, despite being the same age as me.
John, you seem to be uselessly flying around the world, but you're not getting anywhere. You're the same age as me and still just a regular employee, and divorced and single too. How sad, being in your 40s and still alone.
In my late 20s, right after returning from my travels, I got married to a woman who was a college classmate. However, we both were busy after getting married, which led to a strained relationship and cracks in our life together. We ended up divorcing after just 4 years. Since then, I took advantage of my newfound freedom to focus on work, traveling the world with ease. But Andrew, who despised me, twisted that fact into something negative, always boasting about his stable home life and recent promotion to division head. He never misses a chance to put me down. While I respected Andrew's position as my immediate superior, I never followed his instructions. He had neither the achievements nor the skills, and he couldn't give me any instructions, let alone offer decent advice in the overseas field where I was a seasoned veteran. His jealousy over my work accomplishments undoubtedly fueled his behavior. Andrew's snide remarks and slander towards me grew worse by the day, but as a laid-back person, I largely ignored him, just as I did with George, and didn't let it bother me. My indifferent, laid-back attitude seemed to only increase George and Andrew's animosity towards me. After finishing up the remaining tasks in New York that I had promised the late founding president, I set off on another long-term overseas business trip. I returned to Malaysia. This business deal in Malaysia was actually a huge opportunity for Johnson Trading, perhaps the biggest since the company started. I went back to Kuala Lumpur to finalize a major long-term contract with Rainbow Corporation, a company headquartered in Malaysia with a chain of restaurants across Southeast Asia. After 3 months of tough negotiations, I finally closed the deal, and the joy of seeing my efforts pay off was overwhelming. Eager to share this big success with everyone at the New York headquarters, I returned home with great excitement. I showed up at the headquarters after 3 months, bringing someone with me. But what awaited us was the blatant malice of the second president, George, and the Foreign Affairs Division head, Andrew, both wearing ironic smiles. When I greeted them and started to report my success in Malaysia, George cut me off with a smirk and said,
"You're fired."
George then gave a nod to Andrew. Andrew then, as if he had been waiting for this moment, gave George a sycophantic smile before turning to me and said,
John, you ignored my instructions to handle a restaurant chain in the city and instead went back to Malaysia. That's a blatant violation of company rules. So, as the head of the division, I reported you to the board.
I was appalled by Andrew's absurd accusations. City restaurants? That's not even the work of our overseas business department. How does not doing that count as a violation? Ridiculous. When I retorted, George sharply said,
"Don't make excuses, old man. John, you're just an employee. Andrew here is the division head. He's way above you in rank. In a company, orders from above are absolute. You disregarded orders and went back to Malaysia on your own. That's unacceptable. So, the board decided to fire you."
George smugly lorded it over me. I felt deep contempt for George, who was utterly incompetent yet excessively proud. Understood. I felt completely liberated.
Does that mean you surrender?
Andrew said triumphantly. Pointing to the Malaysian woman I had brought with me, I said to George, "If I'm fired, there's nothing I can do. I brought this person with me, but in this situation, I'll leave without introducing her." George responded by laughing mockingly at us.
"Who is this Southeast Asian woman? Did you bring her from Malaysia?" She suits a loser like you perfectly. Introducing her to us would be a nuisance. Just get out.
Well said, George. Looks like John can't even come up with a retort.
I decided it was pointless to engage with these two hopeless individuals any longer. All right, we'll leave now and never come back, but you'll regret this later. As I guided the woman out, George and Andrew hurled unbearable insults and mocking laughter at our backs. These guys will never be forgiven. Hearing their abusive words, I made a vow to myself. That day, I quit Johnson Trading for good. Then, I returned to where I truly belonged. It was the place I should have been all along, if not for certain unusual circumstances. The month after I left Johnson Trading, I started getting daily calls from the company's number, as well as from Andrew and George's cell phones. I had anticipated this when I resigned, so I ignored all of their incessant calls. I left New York and traveled to Malaysia and other Southeast Asian countries for various matters. During this time, the calls from George and Andrew continued daily. One day, while I was staying in Kuala Lumpur, a beautiful Malaysian woman came to visit me. Her name was Sophia, and she was the Malaysian woman I had taken with me to Johnson Trading's New York headquarters when I returned to the US recently. Sophia smiled mischievously at me and said,
"When we notified them that we were terminating our contract with Johnson Trading and signing an agency agreement with another American company, George panicked. He calls every day, crying, 'Please wait a little longer. We'll send John to negotiate, even though you already quit.'"
I replied with a wry smile. Neither George nor Andrew could have ever imagined that you were the daughter of the chairman of Rainbow Corporation. Well, they're just opportunistic villains. Let them reap what they've sown. Yes, Sophia was the daughter of the founder and CEO of Rainbow Corporation, a high-end restaurant chain headquartered in Malaysia that offered Malaysian, Thai, and American cuisine across Southeast Asia. She was also the company's head of American operations and my girlfriend.
"Those fools will now face the consequences of kicking you out based on personal dislike. They'll learn the hard way about karma."
Indeed, if we don't teach villains like them a lesson, other employees and associates might end up facing the same ordeal I did. I'll make sure to get my revenge. I looked at a distance as I said that to Sophia. Half a month later, after finishing my business in Kuala Lumpur and Singapore, I returned to New York. During that time, the incessant calls from George and Andrew continued daily, but I consistently ignored them. However, upon my return to New York, I decided to finally answer one of the calls. When I picked up, the caller was so surprised that he was silent for a while, clearly not expecting me to answer. "Hello, this is John." When I answered, a frantic voice came from the other end of the line.
Hello, finally you answered. John, you've caused a huge problem. Come back to the headquarters immediately.
As George babbled on in a panic, I replied wearily, "What? I'm the person you officially fired and who left Johnson Trading 2 months ago. You let me go in a rather harsh manner. Now you're demanding that I return to headquarters immediately? That's quite a strange request." George, on the other end of the line, started yelling almost hysterically.
The company, the overseas business contracts are in trouble. The big Asian clients you were handling, like Rainbow Corporation, have all suddenly terminated their contracts with us. What's going on? Do something.
His voice was nearly a scream by the end. Since this was all within my expectations, I just smirked and replied coolly, "I warned you when you fired me. You'll regret this later. Remember, it's a boomerang you threw yourself. It's none of my business now. You'll just have to deal with it on your own." George continued to yell and plead on the other end of the line, but I ignored him and hung up the phone. The following week, an unexpected visitor came to the headquarters of Smith Services, where I serve as CEO. The place I was meant to be all along was indeed Smith Services. Smith Services is a company founded by my father, which expanded a chain of restaurants and bars across the U.S. As the only son of the founding president, it was decided that I would be the successor to this company, even before I entered college. However, I strongly resisted living a life on a predetermined path and rebelled against my parents as much as possible. This rebellion was manifested in my decision to drop out of college and live a wandering life as a backpacker around the world. Ironically, during my travels, I came to deeply appreciate the greatness of American food and culture. Upon returning home, I decided to dedicate myself to my father's company, which focused on American food. After successfully launching several new American food chain brands, I was sent to Johnson Trading, whose late founding president was an old friend of my father's, as a seconded employee. This was because our future visions aligned. Despite our domestic success, I was eager to promote the greatness of American food and culture overseas. Johnson Trading, a mid-sized trading company, had significant distribution channels in Southeast Asia, and to leverage these channels, I moved to Johnson Trading as a seconded employee. I rapidly expanded our channels and established American food restaurants, talented personnel, and food supply deals in Asia. Only the late founding president and perhaps his secretaries at Johnson Trading knew about this secret arrangement. Neither Andrew, the head of the Foreign Affairs Division, nor George, who suddenly became the second president, knew why I had joined Johnson Trading mid-career. I had a contract ensuring I wouldn't be given any official position at Johnson Trading, allowing me to return to my rightful place at Smith Services whenever needed. Apparently, George and Andrew finally heard about my true place from one of the former president's secretaries or someone who knew the situation. George and Andrew, looking pale and anxious, visited the headquarters of Smith Services, where my father, the president, and I were. I instructed the receptionist to show them to the conference room. Then, accompanied by someone, I entered the room where George and Andrew were waiting. That someone was Sophia. When George and Andrew saw us enter, their faces turned pale and their eyes widened in shock.
I never imagined you were the heir to Smith Services, John. If only you had told us.
Taking my seat, I coldly stared at them and replied, "Told you? George, you're supposed to be a company leader, someone people look up to. Do you think it's acceptable for such a person to change their attitude and judgment based on someone's backing, behaving in such a servile and contemptible manner?" George, in stark contrast to his previous disrespectful attitude, began to explain himself humbly.
No, that's not it. The reason I treated you like that was because Andrew, the head of the overseas business department here, was always bad-mouthing you to me. I was skeptical, but it was Andrew who.
Realizing he could no longer make excuses, Andrew stopped his usual sycophantic behavior and turned on George.
You liar. You were always the one telling me. It's annoying how John flies around securing contracts without being tied down to the company. Push him out because he's a nuisance. And now you're blaming me? How despicable can you be, George?
I listened in utter dismay to their grotesque exchange, which was like a battle of filth between the two of them. Then I delivered the final warning. Enough. This is pathetic. You can't erase the foolish sins you've committed. The overseas business department at Johnson Trading is finished. Sophia, sitting next to me, then declared to them,
I am the daughter of the chairman of Rainbow Corporation, headquartered in Malaysia.
Hearing this, George and Andrew turned completely pale and began to tremble.
Our company has terminated all contracts with yours, and we have reestablished all related agreements for the American food restaurant chain across Asia directly with Smith Services. This action is not just from our company, but all our business partners headquartered in Southeast Asia are doing the same.
At this revelation, George finally let out a scream.
So that's why all our Asian clients dropped us at once. Damn it. John, you.
To my astonishment, George flew into a rage, stood up, and tried to punch me. However, as an advanced Muay Thai practitioner, there was no way such a weak punch could hit me. When I easily dodged his weak punch, George missed and lost his balance, falling clumsily to the floor. Seeing George's ridiculous display, Andrew, perhaps already resigned to their fate, burst into loud laughter, mocking him. You two are finished. For the sake of the late founding president and the innocent employees of Johnson Trading, I'll do my best to save the company. But George and Andrew, you two are unforgivable. Spend the rest of your lives reflecting and atoning for your actions. With that, Sophia and I quickly left the conference room.
Damn it, you bastard.
I could hear George's final angry shout, like a parting shot, from behind me. The following month, George was dismissed as president, and Andrew was fired. The series of events dealt a devastating blow to Johnson Trading's overseas food business, significantly worsening the company's financial condition. However, as the CEO of Smith Services, I intervened and separated Johnson Trading's food service division, bringing it under the management of Smith Services. This move improved Johnson Trading's financial health, allowing the company to stabilize. My former overseas business department colleagues, now part of Smith Services, are thriving in their new environment. After being dismissed, Andrew's stable family life, which he had often used to make snide remarks and belittle me, fell apart unexpectedly. His wife left him, taking the house and demanding alimony. All Andrew had left was the hefty mortgage payments on the house and child support for his daughter. Now, he works grueling jobs year-round just to make those payments. After being dismissed as president, George lived off the assets and shares left by his father, the former president, for a while, but eventually squandered them all. I heard through the grapevine that he also failed disastrously in his investments and recently declared bankruptcy. George, who had never known hardship, now faces a grim and challenging life ahead. Nearly 2 years have passed since then. I officially took over as president of Smith Services, succeeding my father. My father became the chairman. As the new president, I am now busier than ever, traveling not only across Asia, but also throughout Europe to expand our business globally. My relationship with Sophia remains strong, but having been burned by marriage once, I'm hesitant to take that step again. For now, I prefer to maintain our more relaxed romantic relationship. What excites me most is seeing my former colleagues and juniors from Johnson Trading's overseas business department, which nearly collapsed, grow into dependable professionals. They now travel the world with me, promoting the allure of American food. These vibrant and exciting daily experiences bring me the greatest joy these days.